So earlier this year, someone told me something to do with polyculture gardening that was new to me, and I'll never forget it. But it's kind of funny because sadly I've forgotten who told me. So if it was you that told me this, please let me know down below in the comments, because I'm so gutted. I think I was just so amazed by this that I forgot who told me. But it makes total sense, and it's to do with polyculture gardening. This here, in my permaculture garden, it's a half-sized allotment plot. As you can see, it's quite diverse, even though it's later on in the season. I'm doing a lot of mulching. I'm mulching with a lot of things because I really believe in the power of earthworms, and so I want to put down things like leaves and grass clippings that over winter worms can pull into the beds and make it nice and healthy. And the thing about polyculture is it has many benefits that everyone knows, like reduced pest and disease issues. That's like a core benefit. I also think visually a polyculture looks lovely. It's kind of like a very naturalistic feeling. So this garden here, especially over August and September and into early October, it felt like a jungle. It was such a lovely space to be in. It almost felt like a little kind of slice of nature, even though everything was planted through a mode of design. I made decisions about where I planted everything. Now, what was it about polyculture that this person told me that blew my mind? Well, it's something each and every one of us can utilise, and it is probably, if you haven't started growing in polycultures yet, this might inspire you, or at least might inspire you to try. The lovely thing about polyculture is that it's mixed. You've got lots of different crops growing in and around the garden. And one of the things that I found, I always find like really nice, when I do a garden tour, I get comments where people say, "Oh, Hugh, your garden, it looks so full. How do you keep it so full?" I always struggle because I might harvest a bed and might not have enough seedlings or things like that. So polyculture looks so full because you're growing lots of different things. And so if you're just harvesting a small amount, you can just plug that gap with a few plants. But there's another reason why it looks so full. Because another kind of comment that I get is, "Hugh, do you actually have any pests or diseases?" Yes, this garden had pests and diseases this year. I had lots of slugs, for example. So yeah, with the slugs that was tricky to begin with. But one of my squash plants got powdery mildew. The others didn't. That was great. Partly because they're not right up against each other. I did get a little bit of cabbage white butterfly damage, but again it was very minimal. A little bit of aphid, but again minimal. For a permaculture garden, and this is something that I speak about in depth in my upcoming book, The Permaculture Garden, which is how to work with nature and not against it. One of the things that I talk about is that you need some pests in the garden in order to create that natural balance, in order to have that predator population here in the garden. And so that kind of ties into what this person told me about the benefits of polyculture, or the underrated benefit of polyculture. Because when you're growing lots of different things, the amazing thing about polyculture is that it kind of hides, or it masks, any of the deaths or the mistakes, or masks any plants that are getting damaged by pests or diseases. It kind of creates a bit of an invisibility cloak, because everything looks so diverse and abundant. It's really hard to spot maybe that one plant that has been completely nibbled by slugs. So the way that I see it is, when I come into the garden, if I spend a little time looking through, there's always going to be some plants that just aren't quite as happy. They may be a little bit too crowded. They might have had a pest or disease issue. But the lovely thing that I find with polyculture is that if I do see a pest or disease issue, I don't panic. Most of the time, I just let it run its natural course, or I might just remove the plant there and then and put it somewhere else. It's much easier to remove one plant and put it on the compost bin and not think so much about it. It's much harder mentally to remove a whole bed full of plants. And so by growing in a polyculture, by growing lots of different plants together, it looks so abundant and so different that it hides any of the failures from a nice view of the garden. You really have to go up and look to find the failures, and they are there. I had those this year where I had plants that weren't super happy. It's part of gardening. I had plants that were struggling for whatever reason. I had plants that I might have, because it was quite crowded, I might have accidentally knocked a plant over and broke it in half, and it just started dying and I didn't even notice it. So in some ways it can be a little bit of a hindrance not noticing those things, but it is a hindrance that I'd far rather take, or a little bit of a consequence that I'd far rather accept, in order to have a garden that every time I come to the garden and I walk through it, it feels lush and living and thriving. And we have to remember that in a garden there is no life without death. The death part is what's under here. It's all of the stuff that's starting to decay. It's putting all of the nutrients back into the ground. It's feeding the soil life. We all know how important compost is. For starting the majority of my plants, I need compost, and in order to have compost, I need that death of the plant material, but also the death of the microorganisms like bacteria that then make those nutrients plant available. And so grow in a polyculture if you want to have a garden that tricks you, or tricks visitors into thinking, wow, it's so full, because it does take a little bit of time to spot those failures. But because it's just a little bit of failure and it's surrounded by abundance, it doesn't stick out to you as a gardener like a sore thumb. Because if you have a whole bed of something that fails, it's really demoralising. But when you see a plant here or a plant there fail, it isn't demoralising at all. You're like, oh well, I'll just put something else there. And for me, making that realisation, and not even realising it until someone pointed it out about how polycultures do mask those failures or lessons or whatever, learning that has kind of made me enjoy gardening even more. Like, I felt this year my passion for gardening has just gone exponentially more, and I didn't realise it could. But it's little things like that other people tell you that really stick in your mind, that can make a huge difference. And so next year, think about polycultures. And one way that you could transform it is if you have a bed of something and a couple of plants die, and you're like, oh, it doesn't look organised because there were 2 lovely rows and now there's 2 plants missing. Well, that is just a gap or an opportunity to put something else in, to maybe put some flowers or to put some herbs and get that naturalistic look. Because a garden that feels natural is a garden that feels vibrant. I know that there's a lot of you that watch this channel who have really small spaces, and when you have small spaces, I keep hearing about, and I completely understand it, not wanting to put in a compost bin because it takes up valuable growing space, and so then you're kind of forced to buy compost instead. And perhaps the easiest thing to do is have a worm bin, but that requires a little bit more care and attention. Now, I almost do agree with that. However, I thought, every garden has some kind of pathway. What if we relook at how we use our pathways in small spaces to bring more than just the benefit of going around the garden? So originally I thought about doing this experiment using the pathways on this lower part of the garden, but then I felt if you've got a small space, these pathways are a little bit too big and isn't going to be a fair representation. But at the top part of the garden, we've got a row of raised beds which have a much narrower pathway, and I thought this will be a little bit more of a fair experiment to carry out. So my theory was, if I treated a path like a long linear compost bin and didn't worry about the volume or about hot composting, and instead thought about it a bit like a lasagna, adding on different layers with something carbon on the base like wood chip or a load of branches or some straw, and just add roughly 50-50 of greens and browns, and just keep on building it, keep on turning it, still use it as a path, walking over, the walking would turn it, and kind of see what happens. And so 10 months ago, I created the first ever compost pathway, and now, 10 months later, I've got some of the nicest compost I think I've ever made. And we finished filling this around 5 or 6 months ago, just left it to do its thing, and it's turned out really well. So these beds are made out of chemically inert plastic, so I'm not worried about the beds rotting. If you're using wooden beds, a real simple way, or a simple workaround, is just to line the outside of the beds with some old compost bags or something similar, just to help protect the wood a bit. But then what happened is that any time when I was just kind of like going around and weeding the beds and everything, or if I got some prunings, I would just add the odd bucket full of material over the growing season, and so the volume built up. We probably turned it around 3 to 4 times and just didn't really think much about it, left it over winter, and now here we are in spring with such a lovely consistency of compost. Yes, there's a few kind of rough bits in there, you know, I've got some old twigs and things that are still breaking down, but this is perfectly acceptable to use as a compost to mulch on my raised beds, or if I wanted to, I could run it through a sieve and I could use it for potting seedlings as well. I think the main thing that I want you to get from this video is that it is very much a hands-off process. You, apart from the odd bit of kind of forking over, you just leave it alone. You do its thing, you still use it as a path, and you kind of magically get some compost later on. Now, one little tip is if you do have a lot of dry conditions, there might be an occasional time where you just need to give it a bit of a soaking to add a little bit of moisture. But all in all, I have found this so easy, and now I need to actually work out how much compost has been produced in this pathway. It's important to note, for this garden, we've got a dedicated compost area behind this trellis. So for your garden, all of your material could be going to your compost pathway. And so you could be making even more. For me, that was just the odd bucket here and there. But if you're putting all of your kitchen waste, etc., there's a huge amount of potential. And so to do that, I'm going to see how many of these potato tubs, which are 30 litres, I can fill using the compost and the material in the compost pathway. So all of these buckets are filled now with compost, and it is a lot. If you think about each bucket being 30 litres of compost, we've got 11 buckets here. That's 330 litres of compost that we've made. I reckon there's probably an extra, I don't know, 20 if I really wanted to scrape out the dregs, but that's a huge volume of compost to produce from a pathway that is 3 meters wide. It was also very satisfying and very easy to just scoop up all of the material and put it in the buckets. Now, if you want a very easy calculation to work out how much compost you need for mulching your beds, if we stick with a 3 centimeter depth, quite a nice decent depth, which is just over an inch deep, 30 litres of compost covers a square metre of soil with a 3 centimetre deep mulch. That means with these buckets we can mulch 11 square metres of growing space, and if you included all of the extra bits and maybe dropped it down to 2.5 centimetre, a 1 inch mulch, then you could easily mulch 3 raised beds of this size, 3 by 1.2 metres, with compost from a single pathway. So this space here can mulch this bed, that bed, and the other bed behind it if you're growing for intensive annuals. And I think that's very empowering. And it's my hope that anyone with a small garden can now start to produce their own compost and become more resilient with it. So last night I was on YouTube, as I usually am, and this video popped up by one of my absolute favourite gardeners, David the Good, but he's based in Florida, but I love to kind of get different ideas. And he probably had the best introduction to a YouTube video that I've seen for a while, but I don't think David knows how important the topic is. Well, he does know, that's why he's made a video about it, but I don't think the gardening community knows just how important the topic is. The title of his video was Just Let It Die. So this is already going to be quite an interesting one. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to play the intro to that video, so you can kind of get a sense. And then this is kind of going to be a little bit of a response to that, and to absolutely back up exactly what David is saying.
A farmer once visited me and wandered through this grocery row garden system. And he said, "You don't spray anything, do you?" And I laughed. I said, "No, I don't spray anything." And he said, "What do you do When you have pests, what do you do to control pests? I mean, let's say something is just eating a plant and it looks like it's going to kill it. What do you do? And I told him, I let it die.
Now there's so many things from the video that I would love to unpack, and I might save it for another day. But I do want to highlight a few of those things that I completely agree with, and I also want to make sure that you watch that video because there's a lot of fantastic things, including land race varieties. Land race varieties are incredibly exciting for the prospect that they offer for producing resilient crops. But I want to just talk about balance a bit. So in front of me here I have field beans. I adore field beans, and I'm looking at them now, and you know, there are these little beans starting to get ready, so I'm very excited for those. But field beans, broad beans, fava beans, they have, very often they can get green fly or black fly on the top. So this plant here has no top because it had a bit of green fly on, and I just pinched that out as a nice preventative measure for stopping the green fly from taking over. On the top here I can see there's a little bit of green fly, so I'm just pulling that off. And the other ones are absolutely fine. You can actually eat the tops of these, which is very nice. So this is balanced. This is very minimal intervention. It is one very simple thing that I need to do. And just from this whole plant is going to be protected from green fly. So that is where I'm very happy to go in and make a change or make an adjustment. Now, over here, I've got some more field beans. These are a little bit later on. At the moment, these have no green fly at all whatsoever. But what I'm doing here, this is like a really important part about gardening, about polyculture, is to not put all of your eggs in one basket. So I'm not growing all of my field beans together. I'm growing them at slightly different stages. It's the same thing with tomatoes. This here is a Mountain Magic tomato. This is actually quite a good blight resistant variety. And so if you're trying to create a garden that thrives, you can actually be very clever with the type of varieties that you choose. I don't want things to kind of survive, I want things to thrive. And very often in the garden, I will see something that at the moment I'm kind of keeping on top of it. But if I see something that just doesn't look happy, I'm more than happy actually pulling it out and replacing it with something else. And so at the moment, there are these empty areas, but these have all been sown up. But I want to show you just another quick example of why kind of polyculture is so important and not putting all of your eggs in one basket. So in here, I had quite a big bit of gooseberry sawfly, and gooseberry sawfly is never fun. I did very little about it because every year the plants always seem to come back. I had the gooseberry harvest was nice. But the gooseberry sawfly was here, and in another location I want to show you how those gooseberries are doing. So here are our other gooseberries, and there is not a single sign of gooseberry sawfly. I had the sawfly in the kitchen garden around 4 weeks ago, and so this is just like a perfect example of if you have a garden, even if it's a small garden, you can split things up. Like I'll often do a patch of garlic in one end and another patch elsewhere, just to reduce the chances of a pest or disease obliterating the whole crop, which is what happens when you have a monoculture, which is why polyculture is so important. But you know what I think is even more important than polyculture? Okay, maybe not more important, but I'd say on the same level playing field, is that a garden needs pests. So one of the most important things that David says in the video is about how he does encourage pests to be in the garden, and I completely agree. I say a garden needs pests. Very often that'll raise a few eyebrows when I'm giving a talk at a local gardening group or something, but if there is no pests, there is no food source or no incentive for the predators to be there. A garden is essentially, I'd like to treat it as its own little mini ecosystem that has a nice blurred line that links in with the nature and wildlife around the place. And so I absolutely want pests in my garden, because if I have pests in my garden, I have a reason for the predators to be in my garden as well. Nature is all about balance. I always feel like to have like a thriving garden, you have to work with nature as much as possible. That is one of the core proponents of permaculture. And one of the things that I try and do to work with nature as much as possible is to then create the insect magnets, like these kind of umbellifers flowers, to encourage predator insects in, like lacewings, hoverflies. They love these kind of flowers. And in the front of me here, I'm planting up this border, which soon, in about a month, is going to be covered with colour. So I've got bergamot, Korean mint, agastache. We've got yarrows, achilles, nigella, cosmos, zinnias, calendula, and of course I had to put a little tumbling Tom cherry tomato in. But I'm creating this as like a beneficial insect border and magnet. But all of these things here and things like this are edible as well. So I don't need to sacrifice growing space to bring in the good guys. I can also form a hybrid where I'm bringing in the good guys and I'm still producing food and flavour. One thing that needs to be normalised are leaves that have little holes in them. I have a few examples around here. This nasturtium has a little hole in it. Really, if I see that, I don't care. I just think, oh, some insect has enjoyed a little bit of nasturtium. That's fine. I'm always on the lookout for when something's going to like maybe absolutely take over, like suddenly the nasturtium is getting completely stripped. And that kind of leads into what is the role of pests and diseases in nature. So in nature, pests and diseases, they're primarily, apart from things like rabbits or deer, which will just is a whole different category, but I'm talking about more of like the smaller insect-based pests. They are there to kind of speed up the decomposition of weak plants. So if a plant is really weak, really suffering, pests and diseases will help break that back down into nutrients that can then hopefully inspire something in the future to absolutely thrive. And so for me, looking around like with the runner beans and the beetroot and seeing little holes in the leaves, I'm totally fine with that. One of the hardest skills I think I've had to learn regarding pests and diseases is to actually be patient, is to recognize if there's a problem, but to kind of just closely monitor it. And I would say in maybe 20% of scenarios, I will actually end up taking action. But in most cases, nature just needs a little bit of time because it works in a dynamic equilibrium. Sometimes it takes a little bit of time for it to catch up. And other times, if it looks like it's actually just going to be a total failure, I'd much rather just accept defeat than trying to like use all sorts of natural organic sprays to like hope that it's going to work, when I could just plant something else in its place. There's an example here. This rose, which was such a beautiful display, just before all of the flowers started to pop, I noticed every single flower head had probably about 20 aphids on across the whole rose. And I was like, there's really not much I can do here. I just left it. About a week later, every single one of those aphids, I could see the remnants of the aphids were just dead. They just died, and I had this beautiful profusion. So I just want to give you a really practical way of encouraging beneficial insects into your garden and to create that polyculture feel. And the way of doing it is by making sure that you have flowers throughout the garden. So this little corner here, this was the end of the leek bed. I've left these leeks here to run to seed because wow, do bees and butterflies love leek flowers. And then along the base here, I've got lots of food. I've got this fennel that is growing nicely. This is tree spinach, which has the most beautiful top, and I also think is one of the tastiest leaves to eat raw. I've got some half-pint peas, I've got this nasturtium underneath, and I've got some zinnias. So it's just this little kind of triangle of the bed I've dedicated to creating a bunch of colour, a bunch of interest, and different flower species, because diversity works in so many ways. A healthy garden is a diverse garden, but it's not just diversity as in like you want some vegetables, flowers and herbs. You want diversity within those categories. You want diversity of different flowers over different flowering times. And the lovely thing about herbs is that herbs also flower, so that can be added into the mix. Now this is just a general approach, or kind of my main attitude or philosophy when it comes to pests in the garden. Like here I've got this parsnip that is now setting seeds, but I use this as a way to attract insects and beneficial insects. And I really feel like if I spent less time worrying about all of the little holes in the leaves and this like odd plant here or there that might get obliterated by a pest or disease, if I worry less about those and think about the bigger problems, like this year, for like so many gardeners around the UK, slugs were such a massive problem. I had to replant these runner beans, for example, because of slugs. But I know that those are a much bigger issue for me than aphids. And so for me, it's about knowing where I'm dedicating the time. What is like the 20% of pests, the category that causes 80% of the damage? This year has been slugs. And so by not worrying about everything, being quite hands-off, has given me the time to deal with the slug issue, which has now been dealt with. But it wasn't fun to start with, and you are going to get years where there is a boom of a certain population. For example, you might have a boom of voles, or you might have a boom of aphids, and it's about being willing to adapt and to respond to that. And that's where you do make a nice big difference. Today I'm going to show you the benefit of having a messy garden. This is one of the best benefits ever. So some of you will remember that this was very much a polyculture last year, and I've only really just been clearing it up properly, getting ready for the new season, nice and patient. But even with a lot of weeding, there is a lot here, and I want to show you how much value you have in your garden that you can use as an additional resource. So what I've done is I went into the chicken area. They are always fascinated about whatever I'm doing there. I was just grabbing some more compost. A couple of them couldn't resist to just go on and have a nice little scratch, and they went for a funny little ride. I then filled this up with an extra half of topsoil. I've mixed it together, and the first clue is here, because I have brought a lot of different plant pots, different shapes and sizes, and I'm going to put them down here for now, because I'm going to need those, and I'm going to need this. And some of you will have guessed that it's got something to do with putting plants in pots. And what I'm going to do is take you around the garden, and I'm going to highlight some of the self-sown things that are popping up. I'm going to pop them on and just show you how much, if you just take a little bit of time to look, show you how much there is already growing. Now the core benefit of this, because you might be like, I don't need, 20 giant tree spinaches. Well, no, you might not need them all, but someone else might want them. So there'll be things happening a little later on this year, like plant swaps. So you can take these plants and swap them for other things that you're not growing. And so essentially, it is almost like creating vouchers. It's a replacement for money, and it's a brilliant part of the gardening community. So let's go and start finding those little things. So I've just literally moved the wheelbarrow out of the way, and here I've already got a few things. I've got borage, I've got dill and nasturtiums. Now these nasturtiums are self-sown from where I had nasturtiums last year. I'm probably going to keep a couple of those in. One of the issues is you're not always going to make a successful transplant, but that's okay. The main thing you want to bear in mind is that they might be deeper than you would have, say, planted them. So like take this borage, for example. I'm just going to go a little bit deeper like that, and I don't want to remove too many of the roots. And then I'm going to find a pot that kind of matches, maybe a little bit bigger. Do I pick out the same size pot? No, I don't. And then I'm just going to put in a little bit of soil and carefully plant it in, fill it up, and I have transplanted myself a borage plant that I'm then going to leave for a couple of weeks to root in properly, and I can plant it elsewhere. So this here is Good King Henry, which is actually a very valuable perennial vegetable that is self-sown. So this Good King Henry is a very cool perennial that I believe self-seeded from this plant that's hiding here, that is already flowering. I might cut it back, but really pleased. And who doesn't love a free forget-me-not? One of the tricky things is sometimes when things are so small and they only have a few leaves, you're not entirely sure what it is. This, I think, is an erginium, or like a sea holly thing, which would make sense because I do have one growing. So I'm going to pot it up and see. This bed is really interesting because I've noticed I've got some seedlings of mountain sorrel, which is a type of perennial vegetable that I brought from Incredible Vegetables. And I'll show you it growing a little bit bigger in one of the tree guilds. But it's just appearing, and there's a few little seedlings about, so I'm absolutely going to go for that. And I've also noticed in here, okay, there is some fireweed which I could grow, and that's what you make Ivan chai out of. But what I'm more excited about is I've got these little Nigella seedlings. So I love Nigella. It will probably mean I don't actually have to sow any Nigella because there's a fair few around. In here, this beautiful red colour is red auroch, and it makes sense because exactly where I'm sat, there's a red auroch growing last year, and there's a lot of seed that has come out of that, which is ideal. There's also this, which are parsnip seeds, because I also let a parsnip sow itself. I might grow on a couple and see how it does, but I'm not going to bother digging them up. But I do absolutely want more of the red auroch around the place. That colour is stunning. And then here I have, I believe, lots of amaranth seedlings of Love Lies Bleeding, which is something I wasn't even planning to get last year. I just happened on some plants, and now its story lives on. So I'm very happy about that. Right, there's a lot going on in here. There are like mustards and stuff. I'm not going to dig up those. However, this is a bit of a surprise. A lot of these are surprises, but this here is, I believe, a self-sown raspberry. So I've just gone and got myself a free raspberry plant. Brilliant. Now, funnily enough, there's another Good King Henry that is self-seeded here. And this, which is a blackcurrant, you can tell if it's a blackcurrant because it's out of all of the currants, it's the only one that actually has an odour. This looks like it's already had a year. I just wasn't really aware of it last year because it was such a jungle. And I have got myself a blackcurrant bush. So what I think I'll do, it's flowering and that's cute. I might let it grow on another year, cut it back and dig it out over winter next year. But again, like a blackcurrant bush, no, these cost like 10, 15 quid nowadays. I've been really impressed by how hardy the mashua has been. And there's been some things just on the surface that have survived, like that. It wants to live. So I've got a lot of mashua plants here for free, and I guarantee I will probably save every single one of them. If you do want mashua, we are going to be selling plants at Dovey Plants, our plant nursery, later on in May. So if you've missed out the opportunity to get the tubers, then just know that there'll be a few plants available. But the best thing to do is sign up to the newsletter, because that's when you get notified of a restock. Oh, a free strawberry. Don't mind if I do. Calendula. Perfect. This here is bulbous nettle, which makes a great ground cover, and it sends these little bulbules that then grow into new plants, which is exactly what is happening here. I don't need all of these plants, so it's perfect. I can hopefully rescue these, grow them on, and place them elsewhere. This here is giant tree spinach, and it is such a beautiful plant. It is very similar to the red auroch. Now, for anything that you do dig up, put them in a pot as quickly as possible and then give them a good water. Something like this will flop a little bit, seem very upset, but after a few days it'll bounce back into life. So give it some time and it'll be okay. And here I've just spotted a little miniature musk mallow. Now, I was going to do a challenge of just setting a timer for 10 minutes to see how many plants I could pot up. What's ended up happening, just so I can make sure Will gets home in good time tonight, what I ended up doing was getting distracted by all of the other things that I didn't realise were growing here in the garden. And so in total, there might be a couple more, but in total we've got 17 different seedlings worth, including the borage and the raspberry. And here you can see that selection, and almost all of these plants, there are multiple plants. So I would estimate that I could get 200 or 300 plants out of this small space that I can grow on and I can swap with other gardeners for other things. If if you're someone that likes to grow food, which is basically the only reason why I garden, I am driven by flavour, you'll be very pleased to know that perennials play an essential role in creating a resilient garden and give you a huge amount of opportunity to save money when done right. And I'll cover those in the 8 reasons in this video why I'm growing more perennials. But firstly, what is a perennial? A perennial is quite a broad term for a plant that grows anywhere more than 3 years. So 3 years is a short-lived perennial. Asturian tree cabbage is an example of that. But then you have things like soft fruit. These are red currants in front of me. These can grow for like 15, 20 years. But then you can have things like grapevines, which can easily grow over 100 years. So it's a very broad category. So I'm going to give you, I think, my favourite reason why you should consider growing more perennials first. And it's to do with cost, because you don't need compost to grow perennials. Perennials, they're not anywhere as close as hungry as annuals are. And so what that means is if you've got perennials like these are different herbs, you can just put in a load of mulch, plant them, the mulch is just going to gradually break down and add fertility to the soil. But I don't need to use expensive compost or homemade compost to mulch my perennials. Instead, what it allows me to do is to better prioritize the homemade compost for those hungry annual crops. And it actually opens up a lot of breathing space when it comes to adding fertility for these perennials. If the last point wasn't enough of a reason for you to start looking at implementing a lot more perennial planting in your garden, this next point should hopefully help. And it's the fact that perennials need far less water than annuals. And what that means is that perennials are more resilient when it comes to periods of dry weather. Unlike a lot of your annual plants, and they're all small seedlings and you're going around trying to keep them all alive, perennials, once they're in the ground, they're going to start forming really extensive root systems. They know that they're going to be grown for multiple seasons. And because of that much stronger root system, they can access the minerals, they can access the water from deeper down. And so they're a lot more of a hands-off kind of plant when it comes to hot weather. And if you really struggle to water your garden in your polytunnel, and I use things like soaker hoses, the idea this year is I have all of my seedlings and I will hand water those, that's fine. But as soon as anything goes in the ground in any of the polytunnels, they're just going to be irrigated by soaker hoses. I turn on one tap and it all gets watered. Now that's great for annuals, but if it's the outdoors and you don't have that kind of irrigation system, you will have to go around with a watering can or a hose pipe to keep things watered. But the perennials will be quite happy for an extended period of time without needing any extra additional water. I hinted at it in the last point about saving time, but the lovely thing about perennials is that you have a better balance of time throughout the calendar year. So if most of your garden is annuals, you're going to be very busy during spring getting everything ready, pretty busy over summer keeping on top of things, and pretty busy in autumn harvesting and storing everything. The lovely thing though about perennials is that you don't need to do the seed sowing or the transplanting. Once they're in, they're in. Most of the attention that they need is in the off season, i.e. over winter, when you might want to give them a prune or give them a mulch ready for the upcoming growing season. And apart from a couple of exceptions, the only real time that they need your attention during the growing season is when it comes to harvesting. And so the greater proportion of your garden that's put over to perennials, the less time that you need to spend during the nicest weather trying to keep on top of everything. And so instead of it all being condensed in a few short months, perennials allow you to spread that quite intense workload over the year. And so there's always something to do in the garden. It gives you a nice excuse to go to the garden in winter as well, but it also means you have more time in summer to just sit back and relax and enjoy your space. There are many allotments and kitchen gardens that have really big slug issues, and sometimes it might feel no matter how hard you try, there's always a slug onslaught, and it can be a little deflating. So what you can do is admit defeat to the slugs for the annual section, but instead of not growing food, because food is food, you can then introduce a lot more perennials. My experience with perennials is slugs are just not interested. Slugs are not interested in the soft fruit that I grow. They're not interested in the majority of the herbs. They're not interested in the trees. They're not interested in the tubers. And I think it's because with perennials, their leaves tend to be a lot tougher, and slugs are after the annuals, a fresh, like tender growth. But for perennials, we mostly don't grow them for the leaves. We grow them for the other harvests. And so instead, if you switch things around and you just grow a lot more perennials, suddenly your garden will be a success. Yes, you might not be growing the things that you had anticipated, but you flip that mindset to think, okay, I've got a problem here, let's look at a different direction. You introduce all the perennials, and then you have a nice productive garden that will also save you a lot of compost and a lot of time in the long run, and you're probably more likely to get really interesting things that you'll never see in a shop. As time goes on, I'm getting increasingly excited about just the sheer volume of flavours that I can grow here in the garden by introducing more perennials. This polytunnel last year was used to grow a lot of tomatoes, but I thought 2 polytunnels worth of tomatoes was a little overkill. And so what I've done is, instead of looking at maybe other annuals, I thought, what are flavours that I can't grow outside and I can't buy locally, but I could grow because of the help of some undercover? And so here I have an apricot tree. Here within this polytunnel, we've got apricot, nectarine, cherry, all self-fertile, and a pomegranate as well. And there's a few other things going in and going underneath. And so it's kind of just shifting again, thinking, okay, that would take a lot of my time if this is all under tomatoes. But I also want the garden to be a source of joy. And if I can come here and I can eat my own peaches and apricots and nectarines that I've grown, then that's got to be the coolest experience possible. And today I had a delivery, and it is Szechuan pepper and Nepalese pepper. These are trees that grow peppercorns. You can also use their leaves for fragrance as well. They're fully hardy, they grow outside, they're quite compact trees. And so then suddenly I'll be growing all of the pepper that I need. And that's exciting. The flavour, the sheer diversity of flavour in the perennial realm is incredible, and I can't wait to share a lot with you over the coming years. I grew up in the garden from the age of 3, but one of the things that absolutely got me just totally obsessed with plants was propagating perennials. It started off with soft fruits like red currants, gooseberries, black currants. You just stick a stick in the ground during the dormant season and it grows into a new plant. But also things like comfrey, where you can just split it or divide it into quarters or into eighths, and then you plant each section of that plant and it creates a whole new plant. It is actually quite addictive in a good way, because if you have a new area and all of these plants have come from the old garden, then it's quite easy to expand that in terms of perennials. Some are a little bit harder, like apple trees, you need to do grafting and stuff. But you have to remember that those apple trees could live for, if they're dwarf, maybe 25 to 40 years. If they're older, they could live for well over 100 years. And so it isn't needed as much. But one of the most important things in a garden is looking at what kind of assets that you can create, that you can swap for other resources or barter or even sell. And because perennials, many of them are so easy to propagate, especially perennial herbs, you can use that to then swap with other plants and just have it as an asset to help in many other ways. One of the best benefits about perennials is that when you plant them, you never need to worry about soil compaction, because there's not going to be big areas of bare ground. This was the Wi-Fi garden. It's been through a bit of a transition. I need to move this rhubarb. I forgot about it. There was loads of strawberries underneath it, but most of it was annuals. And when you harvest annuals, you've then got bare ground, and it isn't always a good opportunity to put in a cover crop or something. And with the amount of rain we've been getting, that can lead to soil compaction, which can be a little bit of a pain, and it's usually remedied either by adding lots of organic matter or by broad forking, or ideally trying to do both of those. But when you plant a perennial, yes, some of them die back, but they naturally create a mulch, and you never have to worry about soil compaction when you're growing perennials. And I just think that that's another important thing to think about. Many annuals serve one core purpose, which is, say, spinach, you grow it for the leaves, and that's about that. It's an important purpose because you're feeding yourself, but the lovely thing about perennials is that they naturally are going to be most of them really, really good for wildlife and biodiversity. One of the most biodiverse areas are kind of old orchards with meadows underneath. Now this here is a crabapple and there's blossom and that helps the pollinators, but any kind of perennial that you grow and you let it do its thing, you let it flower, like all of the perennial herbs. The perennial herb garden during kind of August is probably the most busy space in terms of insects and pollinators out of this whole garden. I'm trying to change that. I want this whole space to be busy, but it kind of proves it. It's a wonderful way to provide extra forage at different times of year as well. Like you've got it in the polytunnel, you've got the much earlier blossoms coming through, and so that is why you should also grow perennials, because the local wildlife is very much going to benefit. So last year when we planted this rose garden, it ended up not raining at all for about 8 weeks, which is not exactly what you want when you're developing plants. And it's so important, especially at their early stages, you want to make sure that they're getting the water that they need to develop nice and healthily. And so this video is kind of my masterclass on how to water to encourage really nice, healthy plants. Before we look at how to water, the real question is, when should we water? And like almost everything in the garden, the answer is it depends. You can water early in the morning, you can water late in the evening like today, you can water even in the midday, but of course there are going to be optimum times. Now after a pretty tough spring, a pretty tough start here in the garden, mainly because of slugs, now everything feels like it's properly getting underway. I feel like I'm on top of it, and part of the kind of strategy that I use to keep on top of slug problems is to not water in the evening, because when you're doing that, the water doesn't evaporate, and it's kind of this lovely invitation for all of the slugs to go, ooh, moisture, yes please. So number one thing, if you're having slug issues, try and water as early in the morning as possible. Now as time progresses, as your garden gets more full, more healthy, slug issues tend to become less of a problem over the summer months, particularly during July and August. And so if the only time you can water is in the evening, then that's kind of all right. You can get away with that a little bit more. Now, if you're on top of your local slug population, or you at least feel in control, which is the stage that I'm at now, I'm a lot more happy to water in the evening, because watering your garden in the evening is highly efficient. So why is the evening better? Well, it's purely a case of temperature and light levels. If you water in the evening, you don't have the raising of the temperature during the daytime, as well as the sunlight that's going to evaporate that water. And so the water that I've watered here has all night to percolate down into the roots. And so if water is very precious to you, watering in the evening is an absolute must in terms of water conservation. Now, against popular advice, I have no problem with watering during the midday sun. If that is going to be my only opportunity to water my garden, I will absolutely make an exception. Now, in all of the years that I've been watering, especially during the midday, even in a polytunnel, I have never experienced what I would say is a case of sun scorch. I think that's a little bit of a myth, particularly in a climate like the UK. And so if the midday sun is the only time that you can water your garden, that's fine. If you can only get to your garden during the middays, then what you could do is choose maybe more of a cloudy or an overcast day to do your watering, because that at least is going to reduce the evaporation. Because watering in the intense heat, of course, is going to be less efficient, but you're still watering and the plants are still going to get at least something, and that's pretty important. There is another exception I make when it comes to watering during the midday sun, and that's if it comes to transplanting. Because what's so important is you can transplant anytime during the day, but you just need to make sure that you put lots of water in the transplant hole and your seedling is going to be absolutely fine. So my permaculture experimental site is completely off-grid. There's no mains electricity or mains water, and so I want to make sure that I'm very kind of conservative when it comes to looking after my water levels. And one of the most important aspects of that is using soaker hoses, particularly in an undercover growing setup, but you can also install them outside. So this is my tomato bed, and the tomato plant's looking very vigorous. I'm really enjoying the experiment of letting the suckers, which they're not actually suckers, they're called branches, but letting them grow. And the vigor of the plants is just absolutely incredible. But I don't water this by hand. If you have a really small setup, you might not want to do a soaker hose and instead use something like a spray lance so you can get nice and low down to the ground, and I'll explain the importance of that soon. But here I've got a soaker hose setup. So a soaker hose is this permeable rubber hose that allows you to gradually water your beds and to keep them watered. So at the moment my soaker hose here feeds into the IBC tank, which is right next to where you guys are at the camera, and it is just super low pressure, and it is a very simple way of irrigating this. And so what I'll do, it just depends on the week, but usually every maybe 3 to 4 days, I will set off the soaker hose for a day, and then I'll switch between the two beds. You can attach two soaker hoses together, so you've got 30 meters of irrigation length. This here runs down one end and back the other. It will cover or irrigate 50 centimeters either side of the pipe, and it is just the most hands-free way of watering. You can also bury the soaker hose, that will reduce the evaporation, but for me the real winner is how much time it saves, because all I need to do is plug it into the tap, turn it on, and then at the end of the day turn it off again, and that is this whole bed nicely irrigated. Hello and a very warm welcome to my chilli house. I just wanted to show you a simple example of another way that I'm using a micro drip system. This is the Aqua Bloom from Gardena, to water all of my chilies that I've planted here in pots. Each one has a nozzle. This Aqua Bloom can do up to 20 plants at a time. As well, it can lift water by 4 meters vertically, and I can just set it to do a bit of watering once every day or every couple of days. I just need to make sure that the tank is filled up. I will be putting a lid on it, and then away I go. It is very much hands-off gardening, but also super efficient. For me, there are two watering approaches that are absolutely essential for healthy plants. The first one is, when you're watering, try and water as low to the base of the plant as possible, because these carrots here that I've just harvested from the hotbed, it's got all of this foliage, and if I'm watering from the top a little bit like rainwater, all of this foliage is going to be diverting the water off and away from where the water matters, which is the roots of these carrots. And so any time that you can water as low as possible with a hose, or using something like a spray lance, or using something like soaker hoses and micro drip systems, it means that you're getting the water where it actually matters. It doesn't matter about, you're not trying to water the actual foliage, you're trying to get the water down into the roots. And so that's what you want to target. Now for things like tomatoes, it is so important that you do that, and also for potatoes as well. Anything that is prone to diseases and to things like blight, tomatoes in a polytunnel, you don't want them having just moisture sitting about for long periods of time on the leaves. That can lead to problems. And so just making sure you're watering as low to the base of the plant as possible, then you're going to be encouraging healthy plants. My second tip for watering when it comes to healthy plants, which is particularly important for seedlings and maturing plants, here I've got a row of leeks, is the idea of less but more. And what that means is water at less of a frequency, but when you do water, water more deeply. Now this is why I am very happy leaving a soaker hose on for, say, during the period of a day or quite a few hours, but only doing it every, say, 3 to 4 days. Or if I'm going to be watering these leeks, I will give them one water, and then I'll come back, say 10 minutes later, and give them another good drench, just to make sure that all of the water is going down. Because if you're thinking about a seedling and you're trying to develop a really healthy root system, which is integral for plant health, if you want healthy, resilient plants that are going to be more drought proof, they need to have as strong of a root system as possible. And the way that you water can help influence that root system. And so if you always water quite often and it's just a little bit shallow and you just kind of, the surface looks wet, always just go underneath, because very often it is pretty bone dry underneath. All that does is that if the water is only at the surface, there's no incentive for the roots of those plants to grow downwards. And what you want to provide as the gardener is like almost like a shepherd, is to provide a bit of an incentive. It's to encourage the roots to maybe go downwards, because that's where the water is. And so if you do water more deeply, so there's good moisture content within the soil, but don't do it as often, it's going to force the roots to go down searching for that water. And that is how you get really healthy seedlings, stronger root system, a plant that is better resilient towards pests and diseases, and it's going to be better at obtaining the nutrients that it needs. And also, if a plant has a stronger root system, it's going to be more stable. So I've got sweet corn growing here and field beans behind me. If these have a really weak root system and a gust of wind comes over, they're far more likely to be blown over. So another benefit as to why watering deeply but less frequently is so important. Now, if you're a new gardener and you're watching and you're thinking, oh, I've got so many different things I need to water because it hasn't rained for a while, what should I prioritize? Well, it's really important to prioritize the youngest plants first. So that's your seedlings, which I'm watering here, and these are on this wire mesh, which means they are protected from slugs, which is a massive benefit. But anything that you have sown that is really young, like all of these seedlings here, it's really important that these always get watered first, because if these dry out, it can lead to a lot of issues. And when the weather is really hot, I might need to water these at least once a day. So just focus on your youngest plants first, get them through to that semi-mature stage, and then they'll survive much better during periods of hot, dry weather. Okay, I admit it, stacking functions doesn't exactly sound like the most exciting thing, the most exciting principle. But to me, like, once you start stacking functions, you understand how to realize the full potential of either your design or your garden. In a nutshell, stacking functions is about understanding that everything can have more than one utility or more than one purpose. Every single plant, every single structure, every single detail can take on multiple roles that we can use to our advantage as gardeners to get as many different benefits as possible. For example, a polytunnel is not just here to help grow warm weather crops in a British summer. It helps you start seedlings off nice and early under cover. It can act as a garden office. It can be a shelter when it starts to rain. You can use it to store things to dry, or you can use it to dry seeds in. You can use it as a way to isolate plants for seed saving. You could use it to keep your chickens nice and happy in over winter. You can grow all of your winter salads in a polytunnel. A polytunnel is much more about just growing tomatoes, at least here in Wales. Stacking functions is about understanding that every single element in your garden can provide you with multiple benefits or multiple yields. Stacking functions is a bit of a hidden principle in permaculture because it isn't one of the 12 principles, but it doesn't mean that those are the only principles. And I think that the idea of stacking functions, which is something that you kind of come across quite often in the food forest world, is the combination of both the principle of integrate rather than segregate and to obtain a yield. So let me give you an example of stacking functions using the humble fava bean, which is a field bean or a broad bean. And I made a list that I'm going to go off of a few different functions, and I've got 10 pots. Each pot signifies a function that a field bean can provide. Now, one pot is grey, the rest is this, whatever this colour is, burnt sienna or raw umber or whatever. But this grey pot signifies a primary yield of a field bean. Why do we grow them? We want them mainly for the beans. And so I'm gonna start stacking functions here. Now, a field bean, you can also eat the flowers. The flowers are edible, so that's another function. And you can also use it to grow for shoots. The shoots are also edible. You also have the option of using this as a nitrogen fixer if you grow it as a cover crop, which also means you can use it as a living mulch over winter. And then another little thing is, well, you've got the flowers. The bumblebees always seem to love the flowers of fava bean, so it's great for pollinators. But that is not all, because you can get into another layer of depth if you wanted to. For example, you can eat the baby pods, you don't have to wait for the beans, so that's a different kind of harvest. The other thing is you can grow it as a seed crop. The other thing that you can do is you have the organic matter. When you harvest your beans, you have the organic matter that you can use as a compost material. And of course, because they grow fairly tall, they can provide some nice shade, especially earlier in the season for growing your salads. And so this is an example of stacking functions of having like the primary, like food related and then soil pollinators, etc. functions of a field bean. And you can have the exact same multitude of functions for almost everything that you grow in any part of your garden. You can do it for tools, you can do it for polytunnels, you can do it for sheds, you can do it for the potato. There are so many functions that we can benefit from. So this grey pot that signifies kind of the primary purpose, you could choose any other purpose to be the primary reason for growing it, because permaculture is about finding solutions and being creative. And what you might actually find is, actually I do need more living structure earlier in the season for growing salads so they don't bolt. And so what you could do, I don't know if this is going to work, but the shade at the top, this could actually be your primary function or the primary reason for doing it. As long as you identify the primary and understand all of the rest, then you've got something that is really resilient and something that just gives you a huge amount of choice and option when it comes to designing a garden of your dreams. Like, world record. What stacking functions enables you to do, and this is letting some dill grow, and I can see that there's a ladybird larvae looking nice and happy, but it gives you a 360-degree view of a particular element, and by having that amazing understanding, it allows you to make much quicker, more informed decisions when it comes to gardening and reaching your goals. So while stacking functions is a principle, it's also a skill, and it is a skill that you can learn. When I ran my 5-day permaculture kitchen gardening course earlier this year, I would often start a session with something called the object exercise, which practices that kind of creative lateral thinking. And I'm going to show you a clip of it kind of in action, and then I'll show you how you can do it as well at home. But we're gonna set a timer, and I want you guys to come up with as many different uses for a single brick. How many different things can you do with a brick? So, doorstop. There we go. A slug stamper. And then obviously dominoes. And there you have it. All right. So we started off with a brick that you build a house with, but then in 2 minutes we've listed all of those different things that you can do with a brick. That is just a perfect example of stacking functions. So to do the object exercise, all you need is like a pen and a paper and a timer for 2 minutes. And you want to find like just random objects around your house, and then you can convert it to your garden later on. But for example, you might choose like a mug or a clothes hanger, and you set the timer for 2 minutes, and you try and think of as many different ways that you could use something like a clothes hanger beyond its main utility. For example, you could use this in a greenhouse for drying herbs, or you could use it if you're desperate to use it as kindling for a fire. Just like, there's no right or wrong answer, it's just practicing that outside of the box thinking. After the 2 minutes is up, kind of like sleep on it for a day and come back the next day and set another 2-minute timer, and you'll be surprised how many more things you think of. And that's just a very simple example of how you can start to design, or how to find multiple functions from a single item. Permaculture design is about problem solving and coming up with solutions, and the more that you practice this, for example, you could then think, hey, grass clippings, what are all of the things that grass clippings can offer me? And what it means is that if you come up with a potential, or come up against a potential challenge, it is much easier for you to find a solution using the resources that you have to then overcome that challenge. That is why I love stacking functions so much. So of course my future orchard project is going to be more than just one function. It's not just going to be the goal of providing apples for making cider. That is the main function. There's a lot of other things I want to do. I want to experiment with linear food forest designs and techniques, and kind of temperate based and tropic farming, just try out all of these different things. I also want it to be a space for nature and to help wildlife. I want it as a way to create shade, so I have the option, if I wanted to, in between, to maybe run chickens in between the apple trees. That would be quite nice. I also want to integrate soft fruit and certain herbaceous plants within the orchard, so it's not literally a monoculture of apple trees. And the other thing I want to do is I want to grow very rare varieties, so I can keep kind of the genetic pool going, and just to protect them from extinction. The other function that I want from this space is like a nice kind of naturalistic aesthetic, which is why I am planting on contour. I'm not using keyline design, so it doesn't matter if the row's widen or narrow. It's going to have a really nice kind of feel that maps out the pattern and the shape of the land. In my upcoming Hughes Garden Diaries video, which, well, yes, it's coming back, but onto Substack, not YouTube, I will be explaining it in more detail about how to do contours, how amazing it is with the Moja 2 Pro, but also if you just have a small space, you can create something called an A-frame, super easy, and you can use that to measure your own contours as well. And we go into the benefits of contours and all of that, so stay tuned. A huge part of permaculture design is observation and observing plants and how things work and how we can benefit from them. So everything has more than one function that you grow in your garden. Okay, this white cosmos, it isn't edible, but it looks lovely. But it doesn't just look lovely like outside. You can use it as a cut flower to bring inside. You can, at the moment, there's actually a fair few bumblebees enjoying it. I could grow it as a seed crop if I wanted, and it's a nice way to just enclose this space, and it's still helping soil life by putting out the root exudates and the sugars into the soil. So again, it's multifunctional. Everything is multifunctional in the garden, and I kind of feel like the more that we understand how multifunctional everything is, the more depth we have to creating a really, really productive garden. This here is not waste, and watch this video to find out why. In a garden, it's very easy to grow a surplus of foods, like, oh, I don't need all of this Vietnamese coriander, and I've got all of this chard here. And so the default, if you do have a surplus, is always going to be, is there other people that I can share it with, be it friends, family, neighbours, or local food bank. But, big but, sometimes it's not always possible to share things. We might be busy, might be trying to go away on a little weekend break. And so this video is presenting a case of why putting perfectly edible food on the compost bin is not waste. So in the secret garden behind me, I've been focusing a lot on self-sufficiency, and it's been making me rethink about how we look at waste and how we define waste. And I think it's important to define waste. I forgot what the definition is, haven't it? It says insert definition. So waste is to use or expend carelessly, extravagantly, or to no purpose. So we should bear that in mind. So a lot of you know I'm into permaculture, and permaculture is about looking at natural patterns, and we all understand that there is no waste in nature. There's a wild blackberry, and there are some mouldy old blackberries on here, which as a forager you might think, oh, what a waste. But in nature, it's either going to fall down onto the ground and it's going to release those nutrients to supply next year's harvest, or it's going to keep the fruit fly population in good check. And fruit fly are a bit like the plankton of the earth. They're at the bottom of the food chain, but still very important. So everything serves a function. There is no waste. It's simply nutrients being used in different areas. So why do most of us have a kitchen garden? Well, it's usually to grow food. What is food? Like, what are these tomatoes? Well, basically nutrients expressed in the form of a tomato that happens to taste quite nicely. But where do these nutrients come from? It comes from the soil. How do we provide those nutrients? Usually it's through compost. And I think a big thing about self-sufficiency is trying to understand where you strike the balance of bringing in compost from external places, as in buying compost just to grow food, where you draw the line. If you're buying in loads of compost, why don't you just buy in loads of wholesale organic produce? And so what you have, if you're dependent on buying compost, it's not exactly a resilient system. And I think even though I'm never going to be fully 100% self-sufficient in compost, I do want to be as resilient as possible. And so viewing the food that we grow simply as expressions of nutrient means that if I put this on the compost bin, it's a nutrient that I can use later down the line when it returns to the soil and I can grow something else in its place. I think in this day and age, a lot of us are trying to grow food in order to create resilience. And I think that being resilient is not just about growing food, it's also about producing the nutrition and the fertility that grows that food. It's a bit like, would you rather just have an electric car, or would you rather have an electric car that comes with an off-grid solar system? I definitely want the latter. It's the same here in the garden. I don't just want a garden full of food, I want to have the compost and the nutrition that makes that available in the first place. A big part of permaculture is sharing the surplus, and I think that we could put compost bins in that realm of things that we can share a bit of surplus with. And so I can put this chard in here, and that chard could be next year's tomatoes, which I'm more likely to eat anyway. When it comes to composting and creating as much as we can, usually we can use waste materials from our local community, which is seen as waste, but not in the eyes of a gardener, because we see that waste as another form of expression of nutrients. And also we have crops that might go wrong. This is Tom. Tom is a spaghetti squash that decided to get eaten by something and rotted on the inside. So Tom can make his house here in the compost bin. Also, all of the plant matter that comes out of the garden, that obviously is going to go onto the compost bin, but we don't have to stop at all of the excess plant matter. I don't mind putting on a little bit of surplus of food, because there's some scenarios where that might make sense, and we'll run through those now. One example where you might want to put perfectly edible food on the compost is that you might try a variety of a crop that you really like usually, but the variety just doesn't taste very good. And I think in that case it would be a little bit cruel to just give that to your neighbour and say, no, I don't like the flavour of this, so you have it. And so going on the compost to grow varieties that you like better next year is a worthy reason. Another example is crops that are either quite perishable, like salads, or ones where you're always going to have way too much to deal with. This could be spinach, lettuce, chard, etc. And so rather than trying to think of ways of packaging them and giving them to people where it's not wilted, it's perfectly fine just putting it on the compost bin and just harvesting the things you like. For example, you might prefer to eat the stems, and so the leaves which are edible, they can still go on the compost. There's a lot of cases in the garden where we do this without thinking, because there's so many things that are edible, like beetroot leaves or fennel fronds or even squash leaves. All of these are edible, but we don't really think about it twice. Carrot tops is another one, onion tops. We don't really think about it twice when we're sticking it on the compost. So where do we draw that line? And there wasn't really a line in the first place, which is why I have no shame in putting this on the compost. There may be a time where you get a little bit bored of a crop and your neighbours get bored of it as well. Maro? One tip that I'd want to give anyone in the garden, I think it's something that always adjusts, is grow the things that you're more likely to eat. And this can mean prioritising where halfway during the growing season, you might have something growing that is nice, something perfectly nice like pak choi or kohlrabi, but then you forgot to sow carrots and you dearly love carrots. And I've got a big bunch of carrots here that are growing nicely. And so what you might have to do is sacrifice one of the crops that you don't quite prioritise so much, because you're going to go and eat all of those carrots. So you could either eat them, but if you've grown a bigger amount, you can either share them or just stick them on the compost, because that compost can grow you more carrots next year. By the way, another real simple way of increasing your self-sufficiency in terms of nutrition and fertility for the garden is creating your own liquid amendments. This is made out of dock, comfrey and nettles, and I can use this for the next 2 or 3 years for any crop that I want. A useful exercise to do is just keep a note of crops that you're maybe growing too much of this year, and it's going to happen every year. There's always going to be something that produces loads, but if you kind of make a personal tally and know which things you're going to be able to easily consume, which things you wish you grew more of, like I always wished that I grew more cucumbers, so I've got lots more this year. It means that you, over the next few growing seasons, you can better tailor what you grow to reduce the amount of food that isn't going to be eaten anyway. Just for those of you that feel that chucking this cucumber on the compost is still waste. I'm probably going to get a lot of people disagreeing with me and giving me some flack about this attitude towards putting this in the compost as not waste. But the world would be boring if we all agreed on the same thing and we were all passive. Let's make it interesting. So whilst I always think if we're sharing produce, I always think that we should prioritise sharing it with others. Sometimes we can't always share produce with humans. And so in that case, we can just save the nutrients in the form of runner beans or whatever, compost them down. We've got that bank of nutrients to use to grow whatever we like the following year. I've been so excited about the response to this composting trick that I've decided to make a dedicated video about it. So what is this trick? Well, it involves one of the most useful plants to gardeners. With this type of plant, you want to get the right variety, because if you don't, it's going to take over your whole garden and there's going to be some serious problems. So you absolutely want to make sure you use the right variety. And that plant, of course, is comfrey, specifically the variety Bocking 14. As I said, it doesn't spread, so it doesn't spread from the seeds, which is great because normal comfrey, like Russian comfrey, will spread and take over, and with its deep taproot is really hard to get rid of in your garden. But with Bocking 14 comfrey, the way that you propagate it is either by dividing the crown or taking root cuttings. So you as the gardener are in perfect control of where you want it to be in your garden. Now, for those of you that don't know anything about this plant, I recently made a video about it, and I'm going to give a very, very condensed overview about the benefits. If you do know the benefits, just skip to this timestamp. So comfrey has deep tap roots, which allows it to mine really important nutrients that we need, like phosphorus, potassium, nitrogen, and calcium. And so with the tap roots, it means that these leaves are full of nutrition, which as gardeners, we can take the nutrients and apply them to the garden to help us grow healthier crops. And it is a regenerative plant, which means when you cut it, it's going to grow back, and during the growing season you can get 3 to 4 harvests of leaves from this plant before it dies back over winter. And when it does die back in winter, it is a perennial and it is hardy. So it means whilst you might not have any leaves over the winter months, it's just sitting there ready for spring to kind of regenerate all again and give you all of this material. And because it grows so much, it provides you with all of this biomass, which you can use for mulching your plants or even adding to your compost bin as a great compost activator. And one of the most popular uses for the leaves of comfrey is to turn them into a liquid feed. And last week I visited a guy called Roger Atkinson, who has an amazing allotment, and he was showing me the way that he makes an odorless comfrey feed, and it is brilliant. So here is Roger to show you his method of making this liquid feed.
Okay, so this is my comfrey patch which I planted two years ago. Comfrey is a great plant to use as a fertiliser. It's got a fairly balanced NPK. It's great for things like tomato. It's probably better to feed tomatoes than the tomato feed you buy. It rots down very quickly. You can use it in a number of ways. You can just lay it on the ground where your potatoes are or where your tomatoes are, or you can make it into comfrey tea. There's a couple of ways of doing that. One way is putting it in a bucket of water and letting it rot down, but that becomes very stinky and very messy. What I do is I cut it. This has been cut 3 times this year. You probably get a 4th cut, although it's been very dry, so probably not worth another cut this year. And then I've got a contraption up here that I put it in, which lets it rot down without water. So the key is it's rotting aerobically rather than anaerobically, therefore it doesn't smell. Okay, so this is where I make my liquid comfrey. It's right at the back of my plot. You could put it anywhere in your garden, out of the way, it doesn't matter. It doesn't need to be in sun or anything. These are 15 centimetre, 6-inch plastic pipes. They have on the bottom a sieve and then a funnel taped to the bottom. And all I do with this is, when I've cut it, you just rip it up. You put it into the pipe. Then I have an old plastic bottle with some stones in and a string, and that weights it down. You put that in, and then that weights it down. 4 or 5 weeks after you put it in, you get some lovely liquid comfrey like that. And that's concentrated, so you dilute that. I dilute that probably 30 or 40 to 1 and put it on my tomatoes. Completely free. Doesn't really smell like it does if you do it in water. It's a great thing. And I just do cover that. I cover that to keep the rain out so it doesn't get diluted. So
what I love about Roger's system is that you're basically creating liquid feed on tap, and it looks really cool, and I like that. There's simpler ways of making liquid feed, for example, just getting loads of leaves, sticking them in a bucket, putting a couple of stones on it, and then just putting a lid over. No water, because it's adding water, which is what makes comfrey tea stink. And then after a couple of months, you have to then tip it out, and it's a little bit of a faff. So Roger's system is nice, clean and tidy, and I approve. In case you haven't gathered, I love gardening, and one of my favourite things about gardening is looking at individual elements, be it plants like this Korean mint or a polytunnel or a raised bed, and think, how can I maximise that? How can I use that element, knowing its characteristics, to get me the most out of my space? For example, this here is kind of the shadiest corner in the garden, and so I was like, hey, this is great for putting some compost bins, which is really useful because it's, you know, using the waste, even though there's no such thing as waste in nature. It's using excess material that I can turn into nutrition and nutrients to then put back out into my garden. But I don't like to stop there. I think, what else? How else can I fully maximize this space? Now, this in front of me is a type of compost bin. It is a hotbed. And in March, I was kind of just looking at it and thinking, hey, how could I get even more out of this compost bin or this hotbed? And one of the things that I was also doing whilst I was thinking that was I was thinking, hey, I want to have a little bit more comfrey in this garden, but I didn't want the comfrey to occupy like beds where I'm wanting to grow food, because as I said, you can't really eat comfrey. And having those two thoughts together, I suddenly managed to fuse them and think, hey, the thing about compost bins is when it rains, it can cause nutrients to run off, especially during the decomposition process. And in Wales, when it rains, it pours usually, at least that's what it's been doing today. And I thought, well, if all of those nutrients are going out of the system, that in a way is lost opportunity, it is lost potential. And then I thought, well, comfrey, it has those deep roots and it is great at bringing up nutrients. What if I plant comfrey at the base of this hotbed to almost act as a sponge, to just help collect, almost a bit of a net or a filter to help collect some of that lost nutrition? Or I always think of it as like lost potential. And so with this hotbed being on a little bit of a slope, I thought, you know, because gravity, I'll plant the comfrey on the bottom side. So as the gravity brings down all of the nutrition, it, at least during the growing season, would be able to soak up some of that. So it's currently autumn in the hotbeds, and I've got squash and still cucumbers growing, and it's producing, you know, more food, and it's just kind of making the most of the rest of the season. But back in March, after this hotbed was filled with material, what I then did was, using a comfrey plant just the other side of the garden gate, I divided it into about 5 sections and I planted it along the base here. And in a couple of weeks, I already had leaves starting to pop through, and the results have been fantastic. So at the moment, there's really not much to see here, but I have planted 5 crown divisions. Little update on the comfrey as a concept is working really well. Now, the result that surprised me the most is how many times I've been able to harvest this comfrey. Usually, if you plant a comfrey plant, just like rhubarb, you don't harvest it in the first year because you want it to focus on putting out all of the roots. However, this has not been the case for this comfrey. I'm about to do the 3rd harvest of this plant, partly out of necessity because of it growing at the base. This is a pathway that I'm sat in, and I want a little bit of access. And so I am kind of forced to cut this back, which is good because then that's a harvest, and then it just sprouts back again. So I did one cut, I'd say in early summer, another cut kind of midsummer, and then this is going to be the 3rd cut or the 3rd harvest. So the fact that it's just put on that much growth in such a short space of time and has yielded so generously means that now this hotbed, because this is the pathway in a way, it's just kind of redundant space. So this hotbed, not only it being one of the most productive forms of growing food per square metre and producing a huge amount of compost, it is now, for this small garden, producing all of the comfrey that I possibly need for creating liquid feed to feed everything that I have in this garden. So this works so nicely as a neat little system, which I want you to take inspiration from and think, hey, if I have, you know, a compost bin or a hotbed, then you might want to apply it. Now, self-sufficiency got so much easier when I understood this one particular thing. And what it is a list. It is a particular list that I'm going to share in a minute. Now, if you're new to gardening, by the end of this video, I guarantee your garden might be up to 30% more productive with no extra effort. It does sound too good to be true, but it's just a little bit of a readjustment at the way that we look at things. And this list, for me, is constantly growing. I'm always learning new things that I can add to this list, new things that I can eat, and that's kind of the first clue. Now, I do try and refrain from being one of those YouTubers that loves to farm watch time by revealing that list right at the end of the video. I'm going to tell you now. That list is all of the crops in your garden that give you more than one harvest. Take this rosemary, for example. Rosemary, we know that we can use the sprigs, nice flavouring for cooking. But the rosemary at the moment is also flowering, and the flowers are edible. So many crops in your garden have more than one harvest. In this video, I'm going to show you some of them, of which there are many. I'm going to try and list as many as possible down below in the video description. And I just want to show you that by understanding all of these additional harvests that you can get from your primary crop, suddenly when I look at this rosemary, I'm not just thinking about these leaves, I'm thinking about the flowers that it produces. Now, some crops can give you 3 or 4 different edible harvests, and I'll include a couple of those as well. Now, in a way, there's actually 3 harvests for rosemary, because this woody bit, once you've stripped off all the nice green leaves, if you cold infuse it in, say, an oil or vinegar, it will release all of the fragrance, which you can use as well. Now, virtually every single brassica I know gives you more than one harvest. This here in front of me is purple sprouting broccoli. Okay, it's maybe just gone past its best, but I can still eat it, and I have been eating it. Really nice grilled. Now, the lovely thing about purple sprouting broccoli is these leaves are also edible. So there you go, an example of 2. Now, once these actually burst and flower, all of the flowers of brassicas are also edible. So this here, you probably can't quite see it unless I harvest a little leaf. This is kale that has run to flower. Now, kale and other things like the tree cabbage that we grow as well, Asturian tree cabbage, when they send out their flower shoots, before they burst open, you can treat them just like purple sprouting broccoli. So there's a lot of crossover. And so in terms of getting into enjoying these multiple harvests from a single crop, that's why I think brassicas are one of the best ones to start with, because it is so simple. This in front of me is a bit of a wild polyculture. For those of you new to gardening, you'll be like, oh, look at all of those weeds, but it's just a bit of an experiment, and there's a lot of things in here that I can eat, like parsley. But the main thing I want to focus on here is this allium that is growing. This is leeks. So leeks, obviously you eat the stem. Now with all alliums, I'll see, I kind of don't want to harvest them because I'm keeping them for the flowers, but I'll see if I can pull one smaller one out. Yes, I can. These roots, so the roots of all the alliums, including your garlic, you can chop those and you can use the roots if you give them a really nice wash. So that's a nice little additional harvest. But what I'm really focusing on here is allowing these flowers to grow. Now, some of you that know this channel, how much I love leek flowers, these big, beautiful puffs of purple, which you can use like giant chives on salads, works really well. And then you can allow them to turn to green seeds, and then you could pick all those green seeds or put them into ferment. So leeks is another perfect example, and everywhere I look, there are more examples. This patch here, I have a interplanting of 2 different legumes. I've got broad beans, and I've also got peas. The peas are just starting to flower. Edible. With the peas, you've also got the pea shoots, which are edible. And then you obviously have the peas themselves. So peas give you 3 different harvests. Broad beans as well. I'm not going to harvest the broad beans because it's not at the right stage, but the tops of broad beans are delicious. Kind of sauteed, cooked, always in a bit of butter. So tasty, bit of olive oil, smoked salt, all of that kind of stuff. But I harvest the tips of these once the flowers start on the broad beans. The flowers of broad beans are edible. the young pods of broad beans are edible, and then the beans of the beans are edible. So 4 different edible harvests from this one plant, which suddenly makes it seem so much more significant and so much more valuable. And that's really what I'm trying to get across. Every single plant in your garden has more than one purpose anyway. It's got its main purpose. If it's a flower, it's the purpose of a flower. Now, it might also give you it might also attract beneficial insects, which is nice, but every single plant, as well as the main purpose, its other use is to help you make compost. Because when it comes to the end of the season, you can just put it on the compost bin, and then that flower could be next year's tomatoes. So every single plant in your garden is already super valuable, but something like a broad bean plant, which just in terms of food alone, there are 4 different harvests, not to mention the beneficial insect kind of benefit of it all, and providing a bit of shade so the peas are nice and happy. Every single plant is amazing. Now, there are some even more unexpected things where this applies to. This here is a globe artichoke, and it's just starting to produce some heads, which is exciting. Now, with globe artichoke and cardoons, you can eat the heads of cardoons as well. There's nothing stopping you, but it's not just this being the only yield, because in a garden, that isn't much food, is it? If you've got a small space, it's not really much food, and you're thinking, what's the point of it, apart from it being really tasty? So what you can do instead with globe artichokes and with cardoons is you eat the leaves. And the way that you do it is you blanch the leaves, either with a load of newspaper or some rolled up cardboard, and what you're doing is you're stopping any of the sunlight, and that you leave it on for about 2 weeks, and it makes it nice and tender, and then you can cut it off, and then you can cook it, and it gives you a big harvest. And for something like a cardoon, you can actually produce a huge amount of food for a family from a single cardoon by using that method, which is pretty cool. And also behind the artichoke, this is a goji berry, and the leaves of goji berry are also edible, so you don't just need to grow it for the berries. This doesn't just apply to vegetables and perennial herbs, it also applies to annual herbs like green coriander seeds. They're fantastic. So allow the coriander to grow. You've got the flowers which you can use, and then you've got the green coriander seeds. So when your coriander bolts, all is not lost. You can still use that crop. In front of me here, I have nasturtiums, and nasturtiums are a great edible flower if you don't mind a little bit of kick, a little bit of spice. But as well, from this plant, you can eat the leaves of nasturtiums, and then when the flowers turn into those green seeds that look a little bit like mini brains, you can pickle them and you can make a caper alternative out of them. So again, multiple uses from a single plant. Earlier in the video I mentioned about learning of new things that you can eat every single year. So last year I remember the biggest whoa no way discovery for me was that you can eat runner bean flowers. Now runner bean flowers, they're beautiful. You can get white runner bean flowers, but the red ones, they're so beautiful. They were originally brought over to the UK as an ornamental plant, and now obviously we realise we can eat the beans, but the flowers themselves are edible, and I just thought that is fantastic. It's like the flowers of squash are edible, of the cucurbits. You can eat the leaves as well. You'll definitely want to cook them, but you can shred the leaves and you can cook them, and you can eat the leaves of cucurbits. And then we've got things like all of the root vegetables. So you've got beetroot leaves, carrot leaves as well, radish leaves, and then with radish you can let the radish grow and you can eat the flowers of radish and you can eat the seed pods of radish. There is so much out there that is edible, and I also want to show you a very popular ornamental plant that gives you some extra edible harvests that you might not know of. So rose season is just starting to come out, and this is Rosa rugosa. It's a wild form of rose, but it is so prolific in its rose hips, which you can eat rose hips. My favourite way ever of having rose hips is they have it in Germany and Austria. It's called Hagebutter, which is this rose hip jam jelly thing, and it is absolutely delicious. Now, of every single rose, as long as it hasn't been sprayed, you can eat the flowers and the petals of roses. So that's really fun. And also, if you're desperate, you can also eat the young leaves of roses. And also, I couldn't miss out the fact that a lot of the weeds that you have growing in your garden, like these nettles, they're edible. Cook them down, they won't sting you. They're a fantastic alternative for spinach, and that really is free food. You haven't had to do anything to get that. There's also cleavers here, or goosegrass, which is also edible. And there's also dandelion. Obviously this is flowering, but you can use the flowers, you can use the leaves. So if you know where to look, there is free food or extra harvest all around you. I was like, what's that flying about? There is just so much out there. And hopefully from this video, you've understood or you can see the potential. So, hello and a very warm welcome back to the garden. I'm quite happy because we've had some rain, which means we're getting a little bit of success. Now, this video here is all about pest control and disease control using natural methods at work. This here is a brassica, it's a cauliflower. And I know most people net their brassicas because of things like cabbage white butterflies. I refuse to do that. And so we're going to be looking into all sorts of things to help make your garden more resilient to pests and diseases. The first thing we've got to understand is, why do pests and diseases exist in nature? Well, usually it's because there's a weaker plant or there's a dying plant, and it's just a way to speed up its death so you can get all of those minerals to be water soluble, to be enjoyed and utilized by other plants. So you need pests and diseases in a natural ecosystem to help with that. Now, the issue with gardens is that we're trying to grow food and we're up against nature, and it's very easy to fall into a trap of always trying to work against nature. Part of that is things like monoculture and just growing loads of things in one place. And that isn't what nature is. In nature, in a thriving ecosystem, you never see really, except for a few extreme cases, a certain disease just obliterate a whole area of land. Maybe it'll affect one kind of crop, but it doesn't affect the whole entire ecosystem. Things can still live, things can still adapt, and it's a similar principle in the garden. The most important thing to get from this video is that diversity, plant diversity and polyculture is the single best way, I feel, to reduce pest and disease issues. It's one of the reasons why I don't bother netting brassicas, and it's one of the reasons why I encourage lots of flowers in and around the kitchen garden. So let's start off with cabbage white butterfly. So the butterflies themselves aren't actually a pest. You could consider them as a beneficial insect because they go around and pollinate flowers. The pest, though, is their caterpillars, and they love things like, this is a spring cabbage that is headed up really nicely, that we're going to harvest today. And when it's very easy to just look away for a couple of weeks and then lose a bunch of brassicas to cabbage white caterpillars. Now, the easiest way of dealing with them, I wouldn't say it's the best, but the easiest is by netting them. The number one thing is you don't want the leaves touching the netting, because this is still a perfectly valid site for a butterfly to come along and lay the eggs through the leaves. And you've kind of got this kind of thing going on psychologically where if you think something's under netting, you think it's protected. And so you just don't look at it because you just assume it's protected. But there's been so many cases that I've heard where people have thought, the kale is fine, leave it for a month, and then realize there's virtually no kale left whatsoever. So sometimes the act of not netting something means that you have to be, or you can be, a little bit more observant, so you can take action if you see caterpillars. So really it's about finding a balance and what works for you. It's easy to see lots of different methods online with how to deal with pests and diseases. There's going to be people that swear by a certain technique, and on the same comment thread you've got other gardeners saying, no, this doesn't work. And what I want to encourage you to do is to be curious, to be quite experimental, and just see how it works in your garden. Take all of these different methods and test it out. And so what that's going to do is that over the years, you're going to build up an arsenal of techniques of knowing what works for your garden and what doesn't work. And I think it's really important to remember with gardening, there's so many ways of achieving the same result. Like there's 50 ways of growing a potato. There's so many ways of, say, dealing with slugs or preventing slugs. And so just be experimental and see what happens. I think that is going to make the biggest difference. One of the biggest challenges in a garden, especially with young spring growth, is dealing with aphids. You can get them, say, on tomatoes, you can get them on brassicas, all sorts of different crops. Now, the best thing to do is to create an environment that's going to bring ladybird larvae, because the larvae eat so many more aphids than ladybirds themselves. And one thing, this is a tip that I did in one video that ended up getting me banned on the No Dig Facebook group, which is simply showing how you make, using a completely natural liquid soap, you make a soapy spray that coats the aphids and it just stops them from working. And that caused a big fuss, but it works really well. I think it's very easy to get caught up on all sorts of little things. It's not going to create any impact on bigger insects, for example, ladybirds or pollinators. And at the end of the day, most of us, we're just trying to grow food to feed our families. We're having a net positive impact on the environment. The fact that apparently putting a little bit of soapy spray is going to cause environmental carnage and destruction, I'm not going to believe that for a second. Don't believe it for a second. Look at all of the life that a garden like this creates. So I want to introduce to you the most fantastic natural form of pesticide that any organic garden could possibly go for, and that is insect life. You want to get as much insect life into your garden as possible. It's very easy to just talk about beneficial insects and just think bees, but you've also got many other different things like ladybirds, but also hoverflies and lacewings, whose larvae really go for aphids and all sorts of other things. Then you've got parasitic wasps. Parasitic wasps are another massive plethora of insects that target all sorts of different things, be it cabbage white butterflies or aphids. And so the way to do that, the best way to encourage this natural pesticide into your garden, which is all of these insects, is super cheap, because it's only going to cost you a few seeds for the most part. So an example, just looking around here, these are some leeks that I've let flower, absolutely adored by pollinators and also hoverflies. I'm letting some of my plants here, like this broccoli, just a little bit run to flower, letting a bit of coriander. Now, I've got other things growing around the garden, like lots of dill, which is just self-sown, and dill flowers really attract a lot of hoverflies especially. And so that cost me absolutely nothing, letting it self-seed, just like calendula, just like all of the borage around here, all self-seeded, all of the nasturtiums, all of these flowers that bring in all of those beneficial insects. And so the only sacrifice you have in order to create a really productive, abundant, and pretty pest-free environment is a little bit of space for some flowers, where 90% of which are edible, and the aesthetic value to the garden is, there's no comparison. What you do by building a strong insect life is that you start to bring in other things, for example, smaller mammals and birds, and then you're kind of treating your garden as its own ecosystem with all of the different natural animal kingdom hierarchies, with us being at the top, enjoying all of the foods, but sharing a little bit as well. And so birds, a lot of them can target your bigger things, such as caterpillars and such as slugs. Of course, birds do like things like strawberries. You can't blame them, can you? So things like berries, we usually end up netting. That's about the only thing that I do physically protect from pests here in the garden. Is any of the red berries I do protect by netting. If you are netting against birds, you absolutely have to make sure that you check that netting at least once a day, because sometimes birds can just find their way in and get a little stuck, so you might need to help them out. And so if you're going away for the weekend, it's sometimes a good idea to take off that netting or get a neighbour just to check, because the last thing you want to do is catch a bird in the netting. One of the important questions is, it's all well and nice in a permaculture kitchen garden talking about integrating some flowers here and there and not planting too many crops so it doesn't all get taken over if a disease or pest comes along. But what about translating this to a larger scale? Can it be done? Of course it can be done. You just change the way that you adapt it. So instead of making it fairly intricate and complicated like this, instead you still grow in blocks, but you can either interplant or then divide rows of crops up with beneficial insect attracting crops, or you can cap the ends of rows. There's so many different ways that these principles can be translated. It doesn't just exist here in the garden, it can definitely exist on a farm scale as well. There's so many amazing no-dig market gardens out there using similar methods. Just a really quick backstory about permaculture. It was started around the 1970s by two Australians, David Holmgren and Bill Mollison. And the term permaculture kind of derived from the idea of joining the words permanent and agriculture together. Permaculture is a design approach that seeks to create sustainable and self-sufficient systems by mimicking the patterns and relationships found in natural ecosystems. It is based on a set of principles which can be applied when designing gardens, farms, even entire neighbourhoods. It's really important to note that permaculture, it's not a set of rules. Instead, it's a design approach that can be used universally. And part of this design toolkit are the 12 permaculture principles, which we should use as a guideline, almost as like filters and questions when we're creating a new system, be it in a garden or being the way that we perhaps want to lead our lives. So let's explore these 12 principles. And as I said, because this is a gardening channel, these 12 principles, I'm going to kind of speak through the mouthpiece of a garden context. However, these principles can be adapted for almost anything that you want to do. And so we'll start off with the first permaculture principle. It's one of my favourites, and it is to observe and interact. So this means taking the time to really get to know your garden and the patterns and the rhythms of the natural environment. So this might involve keeping a journal, paying attention to the movements of the sun, and also noticing which plants thrive in different parts of your garden. By observing and then interacting with your garden, you can best get to know the areas which perhaps perform better for certain groups of plants, or you might be able to notice potential, like behind the camera there is a roof and I'm just having a look at it and I think, well, perhaps we could put a rainwater catchment system. If we just spend a bit of time to take a break, to sit back and look what's happening, we can then think of ways that we might want to make adjustments and to interact. So a real simple example could be there's a plant, but it's not really thriving because it's in a fairly shaded area. So you end up moving that plant to a sunnier spot to give it a better chance. The second permaculture principle is to catch and store energy. This is really about being able to understand how you can capture and store and use the local resources around you rather than becoming dependent on external inputs. A really simple example of this is, as I mentioned before, rainwater. Rainwater capture is a perfect example. Rather than relying on municipal or mains water, by being able to set up a DIY rainwater system, you can then capture that energy, i.e. in the form of water, store it in a tank and use it. And this massively increases the resilience of the garden. Adding organic matter to the soil is another form of capturing and storing energy, because what you're doing is you're using things, for example, leaves or grass clippings, you're breaking them down or you're applying them as a mulch to the garden. That improves the permeability of your soil, allowing it to better capture rainwater, and the higher soil organic matter means that it can hold on to that moisture for a longer period of time. Another example could be you might be pruning your apple trees or something, and you, instead of, say, burning the prunings, what you do instead is you turn them into wood chip, and then you could either compost that or use that in the path. The third principle of permaculture is to obtain a yield. This doesn't mean just harvesting crops, but also considering the other ways that your garden can provide for you, your family, and your local community. For example, a garden, yes, it's going to provide food for you, but can you turn it into like a space for recreation? Could a yield also be a chance for you to spend some time in nature, some time for yourself, sitting by a fire, for example? Another thing you can do is grow a load of ornamentals. So the yields can be an aesthetic yield that you can get whenever you come up to the garden, or you can take some of those flowers down to the house and enjoy it there. think about who else and what else can obtain a yield from the garden. Could you, say, start off a load of seedlings or take a load of cuttings and give these to other individuals to help them grow their own food at home? Or could you dedicate even more space for pollinators so they can enjoy their yields in the form of pollen and nectar? The fourth principle of permaculture is to apply self-regulation and accept feedback. In a sense, this is about taking responsibility and knowing what your thoughts and beliefs are, and understanding how this is going to have an impact on your garden, but also on your community as well. What are the things that you really believe in, and what steps can you take in your own space to help that belief? Maybe there's something you want to change. Well, you can do that starting off in a garden. There's a great permaculture quote that I love by Jeff Lawton. It's something along the lines of, you can solve all the world's problems in a garden. This is also about being open and accepting that we're going to make mistakes. If I make a mistake in the garden, it just means that I just have to make an adjustment, and it's a constant learning process. We can get so caught up in the growing season, but the whole idea with this principle is to just occasionally take a step back for a minute and look at the whole picture, look at the whole perspective and the impact that that's having and how that relates to what your goals are. The fifth permaculture principle is to use and value renewable resources and services. In a kitchen garden, this could mean creating your own liquid fertilisers from plants like comfrey rather than buying synthetic feeds, and planting crops such as perennials that come back year after year. And it also means considering the value of kind of natural or ecosystem services. What happens in nature that we can really promote and build up in our own garden? For example, if we can create more space for pollinators or insects that provide natural pest control, then in a way we're valuing that natural resource, that natural service, and we're helping the whole health of the garden. And I'm constantly thinking, especially in terms of pest control and also the pollinators and wildlife further afield, what are the small things that I can do in the garden that's going to enhance their populations and create more diversity? But diversity is a different principle. There's an example here. I'm by a fire, it's burning wood. Wood is a renewable resource. This is a byproduct from regenerative management practices, for example, hedge laying and coppicing. So I'm valuing that byproduct from the prunings, being able to turn it into heat that I can enjoy. The sixth principle of permaculture is to produce no waste. So this means ways of either reusing or recycling or repurposing any kind of resources that you have, i.e. in your house or in your garden, and making sure that even at the end of its life, it can still serve a purpose. So instead of, say there's a lot of wood offcuts or something, instead of just burning that, you could use the ash in the compost pile, but what you could do instead is you could put it in a pile and let it break down, but that creates a perfect habitat for bugs and insects. The thing that I love about a garden is that anything that comes out of the garden has multiple uses. And so if you can think about areas where you're thinking, hang on a minute, I'm sure there's something I can do with that, there will be. And where we can find all of those little things that we can change and produce no waste, instead see waste as an opportunity, you're naturally going to create a closed loop resilient system. The seventh permaculture principle is to design from patterns to detail. This means starting with a broad view of, say, the garden, and then working down to all of the details that really make it work. So when I'm creating a planting plan, I firstly consider the overall layout, and then I start to fill it in bit by bit with specific plants that I want to grow. And I'm constantly thinking about how the design will work as a complete and efficient system. Patterns are things like, where do you usually find yourself walking the most in the garden? For example, for me, it's going from the gate behind the camera up to the solar tunnel. And that's where I'm spending a lot of my time. So I can be quite clever about that with the design of the planting plan. If I actually plant all of my salads along this route that I'm taking, because I can use salads almost every day during the growing season, it means I'm going to save a lot of time. If all of my salads are really easy and quick to get to, rather than walking to the other end of the garden, I can make it a lot more efficient. And perhaps there's one area right at the end of the garden that you don't find yourself using that much, and it's a little bit of perhaps a waste of space. Well, just turn that into an amazing place for biodiversity. Let nature take over and see what happens. And probably the most basic example of a pattern that we can work from are the 4 seasons. Each season has its own very specific effect and impact on the garden. And so when we're designing, we need to think about how the garden works with all 4 seasons and how that pattern continues on a yearly basis, so we can start to think ahead about the long-term impacts. The 8th principle of permaculture is to integrate rather than segregate. So this means finding different ways that you can combine individual elements of a garden. One example that springs to mind is a compost pathway. So I could have a separate compost space and I could have a separate pathway, but if you use your path as a way of creating compost, you're integrating 2 really important purposes in one. So if you've got a really small space that you're trying to work with, looking specifically at this principle, there's a lot of information online about it, this is going to be a really important step for space saving. Think about how many purposes and how many things you can bring together so your whole garden is working as one cohesive unit. Another common example that I use in this garden is, instead of just only growing vegetables in these raised beds and maybe keeping all of the flowers away to one side, I'm actually integrating the flowers among the vegetables for many various reasons, but the main one is pest control and also in terms of aesthetics. I guess a nice metaphor is looking at your garden as if all of the individual elements are like players on a team. So you've got the undercover team, you've got the polytunnel, for example, you've got the outside team, you've got the containers, you've got the kind of nutrition part of the team, so the composting. How can you find a way where all of the team members work together? It just makes life much easier when things work together. The 9th permaculture principle is to use small and slow solutions. This means if you're setting out a new garden, start small and gradually build up over the time, rather than trying to do everything at once. Instead of creating loads of raised beds, start out with 1 or 2, and as your confidence builds, extend the garden over time. It also means using techniques that are gentle and low impact rather than destructive and fast paced. No dig is a perfect example of this. No dig is a very nice, gentle way of building soil health. We're just applying the organic matter as a layer over the soil. Rather than something destructive, like forking it in, mixing it in, we just let nature do the incorporation. The more that we can let nature do things for us in the garden, the more time that we can spend enjoying it rather than complaining. Another example is you might have an end goal of storing a few thousand litres of rainwater, and you might be put off because that feels like a lot, but instead just start off with one small tank and slowly build up over time. We don't have to reach the goal, we've got to enjoy the journey there. The 10th principle of permaculture is to use and value diversity. This means planting a variety of different crops and different varieties of those specific crops and using different techniques within the garden rather than just relying on one technique. So real simple example is undercover growing is a different technique to growing in raised beds, which is a different technique to growing in hotbeds, which is a different technique to growing in containers. You have that diversity. There's benefits for all of them. Diversity is something I talk a lot about on this channel, and I'm not going to go into too much detail for this video, but you want to just think about a diversity of, say, traditional and innovative gardening techniques, but also things like a diversity of textures in terms of how the garden looks, of colour, a diversity of flavours. How can you get a diversity of pollinators? How can you bring in a diversity of yields that you can get from the garden? You see, with permaculture and the principles, the thing that works really nicely is a lot of the principles overlap with one another. And the more principles that you use that overlap with one another, I believe the more resilient and the more kind of self-sufficient that system becomes. The 11th principle of permaculture is to use edges and value the marginal. So in terms of the marginal, that might be something like the back of the polytunnel. It's a bit of an awkward space. You never really know what to do with that. Actually think about, well, what could I use it? So for the back of the polycrub, we ended up turning that into our fermentation station. So we could do a lot of different jadam and natural farming ferments, find ways that we can use underused space and create a really useful meaning from that space, or a really useful purpose. Another example in terms of edges, there's the whole idea of the edge effect. Often the most biodiverse places in nature is an edge between two ecosystems. So the edge between a wildflower meadow and a forest, for example, that edge, there's a lot of biodiversity. We can do the same thing in a garden. So we're putting up lots of kind of semi-permanent trellising so we can increase the amount of vertical area that we have to grow, and that also coincides with creating a more sheltered space for the garden. Another example of kind of valuing and using the edge is the edge of raised beds. I love raised beds with sides for multiple reasons, but one of my favourite things is being able to grow plants over the edge, for example nasturtiums. So instead of them kind of taking up bed space, I can grow things over to maximise the amount of stuff that I can grow inside. I can also use the side of a bed to, say, attach a trellis to, or even sit down on. The 12th and final permaculture principle is to creatively use and respond to change. This means being flexible and adaptable, and instead of seeing something as like a potential threat, how can you see it as an opportunity? So there's an example where I remember getting almost a whole potato crop destroyed by blight, and I thought, I never want to have this again. The first thing was there wasn't enough diversity in the growing of the potatoes. They were all just in raised beds. And so what I've done instead is, in terms of trying to respond to that, for my main crop, I grow Sarpo Mira, which is this amazing blight-resistant variety. I can grow it in beds, but I usually grow that in containers. Then I grow new potatoes, because new potatoes I can harvest before the blight season starts. So just being able to look at something that's happened, think about ways to reduce the impact. So even if blight did happen again, I'm not going to get that affected by it, and I can still enjoy the crop. Another example of being able to adapt to change was last year when we had the drought and the heat. What I did was set up a load of Gardena soaker hoses so I could water more efficiently, and then I decided to mulch a lot of my more sensitive crops with grass clippings to help keep the soil nice and cool, to help retain the moisture. So just being able to be kind of nimble and be able to adapt to things nice and quickly is going to mean you're naturally going to reduce a lot of potential failures or massive challenges. It's better to kind of nip things in the bud when they first appear. The best bit of advice I can give to anyone starting off with permaculture, apart from don't use it as a rule book, just because it works for one person, it's not a copy and paste system. It's just kind of like a mindset toolkit. And these principles are really exciting. They can help us fully optimize the potential of a space in whatever we want to optimize it for. But just like the slow and small solutions principle, maybe pick 2 or 3 of these principles that I've mentioned that really speak to you and start with that. Rather than trying to use all of them all at once and become overwhelmed, think about what are the 2 or 3 that excite you the most, and how can you start to build that into your planting plan. This is how to prepare your garden beds for winter without using any compost, because you're not going to be growing anything in your beds for about 4 or 5 months. So just cover your compost bins and follow this method instead, because this is going to protect the soil and slowly feed soil life over the winter months. And then you can, in spring, use compost as a precision tool. This is a step-by-step video. So the goal is using organic material rather than organic matter, because organic material creates a much better insulation and it's going to keep soil life a lot more active, particularly worms, which are going to be bringing in that material, and it's going to help reduce any compaction issues. So you're kind of hitting spring on the front foot. So there are 2 main tools that you need: shears and a fork. You might need a trowel, but these are usually what I use. And the first thing to do is just have a look at what's in the bed already. I've actually got a couple of these self-sown Korean mint, which are a perennial. So what I'm going to do is cut the tops off, and because it's a perennial, I actually don't want this in this bed. So I am going to go lift this up as a root ball, shake off the worst of the roots, and that is something that I can plant out into my borders. So anything like that I'm going to remove any perennials. But in terms of annuals, like this here, this rocket, what I'm going to do is actually cut it back to base level, because the idea is with the rocket is that this actually has fairly small roots, so the roots are going to create some soil structure to help stabilize it over winter and gradually break down. And I'm not taking any of this material to the compost bin. That's the most important thing. Now, if you do end up having something that might have large roots, like a brassica or sweet corn or something, that is when I would probably pull all of the roots out, just because in spring it can be a bit of a pain trying to plant around a real mat of roots. So I'm just going to continue getting any of the perennials out and cutting the annuals to base level. Now, the other core thing about this is that I want living roots in the ground for as long as possible. So I'm not really going to clear my beds until I've had the first major frosts. And we've had 2 or 3 this week, particularly last night, which was kind of more like -3, -4. So it's a perfect opportunity then to clear, because soil in its natural state, it wants plants growing. That's what soil is designed for. It's designed to have a relationship with plants. And so there's no point taking out plants prematurely, because then you're stopping that biological process. So having a bit of patience, being okay with it being a little bit messy is okay, because you're just helping to keep the soil in its natural state that it wants to be in. Now, the other thing is that every so often a little bit of disturbance in soil, in nature, is a natural thing. You don't want to do it multiple times a year, but once a year, if you are kind of clearing out, that's fine. And the reason why I am going in and loosening is because I have a weed here, which is creeping buttercup. And creeping buttercup is a bit of a pain. So it's actually something that I am going to remove, because it has these long roots that like to spread out and take over. Something like dandelion, I will actually keep the material here for the next step. But if you've got something serious like creeping buttercup or couch grass, then it's actually best to just get that out. So instead of trying to turn over the whole soil, what I usually do is put a fork in and kind of prise up, just to help loosen, so I can get the roots out like that. And then I'm not kind of turning it or upending the soil. And just a little tip for these roots is, when you're pulling the plant out of the ground, just give it a bit of a shake and it'll just help to tease it all out. So the whole goal is to mimic what happens in nature. In a woodland, leaves fall onto the floor, they create this carpet, and that is how woodlands kind of function for just thousands of years as a process in terms of the nutrition and that carbon. And so we want to mimic that by chopping up all of this plant material as if it's fallen to the ground, but chopping it up so it's smaller, like leaves are, and it'll also help it break down nicely over winter, so there isn't actually much left come springtime. So what I'm going to do here is chop up, and I've got some plant material here which is a bit green, I've got some which is brown, so a bit of nitrogen, bit of carbon, brilliant, and then I'll just lay that out equally over this part of the bed. So remember, just the more you chop it up, the quicker it's going to break down. But another thing is, try not to put your feet on the soil. It's not the end of the world, but when soil is a bit wet and then you have pressure, that is what can cause compaction. So I'm just going to work around, and that's why I kind of go for this kind of width of bed at about 1 metre to 1.2 metres. So I'm not stretching too far into the middle, and it's easy for me actually to just walk around to the other side to do a bit of work. I'm just mixing up all the ingredients. Don't think it'll make a good cake though. And the idea is, instead of taking all of this plant material, putting it on the compost bin, letting it break down, waiting time, and then bringing it back, you're actually just leaving all of the nutrients and also all of the carbon in place, in situ. So what I'm going to do now is just mix it up a bit, just so I know I have a bit of coverage with the greens and browns. And I'm now just going to spread it out so it creates an equal layer. Don't worry if it doesn't cover all of the soil, but you're just creating a roughly equal layer of this material across the bed. So the rule of thumb that I use is you want at least 2 to 3 inches of plant material. So that is 5 to 7 centimeters. I usually do it the other way around, but there we go, of plant material. And the idea is that that creates a nice insulative layer that will be effective over winter, but it's not too thick, but it's also not too shallow. It's kind of the Goldilocks zone. But sometimes just with chop and drop, you're not going to get enough material to do that. I did yesterday when I was clearing out that bed with mashua and ochre and other things. I think there's enough material there. I can always top it up with other stuff later on. But with this, what I'm going to do is use a material that's very available to me, which are leaves. But there's so many other things that you can do. You could even use wool, you can use straw, just make sure it isn't sprayed. You can use things like grass clippings, like in the like kind of the outer islands in Scotland, the Outer Hebrides, they very often just use seaweed as this. Or it could just be other plant matter that you might have from borders and stuff. And the next thing I'll be experimenting is ramule chipped wood. So I'm going to go and I'm going to collect some leaves to then finish this off, because I'd say there's just about an inch. So I want another couple of inches, another 5 centimeters, just to cap it over the top. Now, if you're at a place like an allotment where it's hard to source materials like this, then you have a few options. One is to save the chop and drop, and if you do want to put compost down, put it down, but then at least cover that with some organic material, because that's going to be much better than nothing at all. The other thing I'd consider is actually it's kind of cheaper to buy in things, even like organic straw, as like a bale that hasn't been sprayed and putting that down, than buying all of that compost. And what I found is that I'm only really needing to use compost now for the hungrier plants when I'm planting at the base of the hole, rather than ever having to put down that amount of compost. So the homemade compost that I'm making is enough to power my garden, and that could be the same for you. So what I found with using just organic material like this is that I just see so many more worms now in my garden, which is a very good sight indeed. And all of this material is a bit like a sponge. So we have a lot of rainfall, and if you have just bare ground, rainfall can lead to compaction. So this, it softens the blow and it creates a nice warm insulation, because compost isn't really adding any warmth or insulation. So even today, when it was like really, really cold, at the bottom of the layer of the leaves, there were still loads of worms that were active. So this just helps to keep everything ticking over. I could leave the weeds in if I wanted to, so there is that kind of living plant material, but it's just much easier to start spring with a blank canvas, and we have to be realistic and practical about gardening. So what I'm going to do now is just mulch this. It's just worth noting there are some trees that have leaves that either have potential toxins in them or might be really slow at breaking down. So just look out for those. But usually going with your kind of like native trees is the best option. This is using sycamore, which has naturalized, and sycamore is totally fine. Now I know that a lot of people are going to ask, like, you're putting down these leaves, wouldn't they just blow away? So these were put down a couple of weeks ago, and we did have a storm. But what happens is after a good like rainfall or a good watering, they kind of just like bind together. So maybe you might lose a few off the top, and that's okay, but really it kind of binds together as one kind of core body. And if you're using something like grass clippings, then these really aren't going to be blowing away. Now you, like me, might have some plants that are going to be staying in over winter until spring. This here is a kaolette. The focus here is just work around it. Just work around any plants that you might be keeping in. So all of the soil around is protected. It's actually going to help them keep the roots a little bit warmer, keep the biological life around the roots, around the rhizosphere, actually more active. So you are going to also be benefiting these plants, but then everything else all around can also get to work. So very simple. I've been amazed every spring by how beautiful the soil is as a result. Now, if you're worried about slugs, late winter, early spring, you could always rake off any kind of large bits, but most of it's going to be broken down. And it means that if you put organic material now and focus on protecting the soil and feeding the soil, then the organic matter later, which is both broken down in the bed, but also in your compost bins that should also be protected from the rain, that is when you get to planting.